Well, there are some interesting developments in the relationship between the U.S. and Ecuador. These are two countries that have not for quite some time had many issues between them. We did report at length last year when an Ecuadorian court ruled that Chevron must pay $8.6 billion in damages relating to a pollution lawsuit. That amount actually later increased to $18 billion, and still, Chevron has not paid a penny of it. They call the judgment fraudulent. Then we told you about a decision by Ecuador to grant Wikileaks co-founder Julian Assange asylum. He's been staying at the Ecuadorian embassy for several months, still with no way out.
I speak to you today as a free man, because despite having been detained for 659 days without charge, I am free in the most basic and important sense. I am free to speak my mind. This freedom exists because the nation of Ecuador has granted me political asylum, and other nations have rallied to support its decision.
Well, since that speech at the UN, Julian Assange's health has reportedly been diminishing. Still, at this point, he has no safe passage out. Even if he needed, for example, to go to the hospital, he'd most likely be arrested after any treatment. And now there's this. A three-person tribunal has just decided that Ecuador must pay $1.8 billion to the U.S.-based Occidental Petroleum. As far as why, it's somewhat unclear, though a, quote, contract breach is what's being alleged here. I want to bring in Miguel Tinker Salas, professor of Latin American history at Pomona College. He is the author of the book, The Enduring Legacy, Oil, Culture, and Society in Venezuela. Let's talk first, Professor Salas, about these allegations. What's this treaty or this contract that Ecuador has supposedly breached?
Well, in 1999, Ecuador signed a contract with Occidental to produce oil in a Block 15 in an area of Ecuador. The Occidental company in 2004 decided to sell 40% or to transfer 40% of its interest in that block to a Canadian company. That's a violation of the hydrocarbon law in Ecuador, and as a result, in 2006, Ecuador moved to cancel the contract. So the allegation on the part of Occidental has to do with the cancellation of its contract, and the interesting part is that that block, which was producing under Occidental 44,000 barrels a day, is today producing 144,000 barrels a day. And that's really what bothers Occidental, and that's really what they're going after. They want to get back into Ecuador. They want to get back into the countries that produce oil in the region, and this is part of their strategy.
So do you think this is a viable strategy? I mean, is this something legally, the courts here, the courts there, that they have a chance, of really being able to get Ecuador to pay up?
Well, no, I think the countries of South America, particularly Venezuela and Bolivia, have already withdrawn from this court. Ecuador withdrew from this court in 2009 and doesn't recognize its validity, so that Ecuador is not going to pay the debt, the judgment. They have, in fact, said they would appeal the judgment. And the larger picture within South America is that countries like Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia have exerted sovereignty over what had been previously a series of hodgepodge of contracts given to foreign companies. And that's really what the large companies resent, because now state-owned companies, in fact, if you look at Venezuela, Brazil, Ecuador, these are state oil companies that now are producing, and the investments in those countries depends on your relationship with those state companies.
Now, certainly a U.S. oil company is not directly connected in any way to the U.S. government, but there is concern out there. What do you think, Professor Salas? Do you think there's any reason to believe that this is in retaliation to Ecuador's offer to grant Julian Assange asylum?
I think it adds up to a series of pressures on Ecuador. Objectively, it provides increased pressure, but the initiative before the court had been there since 2006. The case had been filed in 2006. The hearings were in 2008. So that in reality, its timing is interesting. It comes out now. In that sense, we can say it adds more pressure to Ecuador in the broader context of the case with Chevron, which is $18 billion, which Chevron is not paying. But again, the attention is given now to Occidental, and Ecuador is responding by saying it doesn't recognize the court. It has national sovereign rights over its oil production, and it will continue to pursue those policies.
Now, recently, the foreign minister of Ecuador, Ricardo Patiño, spoke to RT, and I want to play a quick part of what he said.
Washington and the U.S. is not our father or our teacher to punish us. We have the same rights as they do. Julian Assange is an example, a symbol of freedom of speech. But there are some countries which try to influence things and limit his freedom, and even oppress him so that he stops doing what he is doing. We want to make them understand that we're protecting freedom of speech, as well as a right to life and personal integrity.
So he's saying Washington, the U.S. is not our father or our teacher. This is regarding, they feel they have the freedom to do whatever they want with Julian Assange. Why do you think he said this?
Well, I think he said it very clearly because in the case of Assange, Britain was acting like an old colonial power. They said they would intervene in the Ecuadorian embassy. They said that they would withhold the right to do that anytime they wanted to. So in many ways, it's a response, not just from Ecuador, but from all the countries of South America who supported the case of asylum for Assange, that Britain has to respect the sovereignty of the Ecuadorian embassy, and it has to respect the sovereignty of decisions made around hydrocarbons and energy issues, the same way that Bolivia nationalized gas, Venezuela renationalized oil. Ecuador has done the same thing.
All right. It's very complicated, but certainly we're going to keep our eyes on what's going on there. Miguel Tinker Salas, professor of Latin American history at Pomona College. Thanks so much.